cold to the stomachs of foreigners who had the distinguished honour of remembering him at a distance of a quarter of a century. He was now in retirement, and hence, in a ponderous white cravat, like a stiff snowdrift, was so obliging as to shade the dinner. There was a whisper of the pervading bohemian character in the nomadic nature of the service and its curious races of plates and dishes, but the noble refrigerator, infinitely better than plate or porcelain, made it superb. He shaded the dinner, cooled the wines, chilled the gravy, and blighted the vegetables. There was only one other person in the room, a microscopically small footboy, who waited on the malevolent man who hadn't got into the post office. Even this youth, if his jacket could have been unbuttoned and his heart laid bare, would have seen as a distant adherent of the Barnacle family, already to aspire to a situation under government. Mrs. Gowan, with a gentle melancholy upon her, occasioned by her son's being reduced to court the swinish public as a follower of the low arts, instead of asserting his birthright and putting a ring through its nose as an acknowledged Barnacle, headed the conversation at dinner on the evil days. It was then that Clennam learned for the first time what little pivots this great world goes round upon. "If John Barnacle," said Mrs. Gowan, after the degeneracy of the times had been fully ascertained, "if John Barnacle had but abandoned his most unfortunate idea of conciliating the mob, all would have been well, and I think the country would have been preserved." The old lady with the high nose assented, but added that if Augustus Stiltstalking had in a general way ordered the cavalry out with instructions to charge, she thought that the country would have been preserved. The noble refrigerator assented, but added that if William Barnacle and Tudor Stiltstalking, when they came over to one another and formed their ever-memorable coalition, had boldly muzzled the newspapers and rendered it penal for any editor person to presume to discuss the conduct of any appointed authority abroad or at home, he thought the country would have been preserved. It was agreed that the country, another word for the Barnacles and Stiltstalkings, wanted preserving, but how it came to want preserving was not so clear. It was only clear that the question was all about John Barnacle, Augustus Stiltstalking, William Barnacle, and Tudor Stiltstalking, Tom, Dick, or Harry Barnacle, or Stiltstalking, because there was nobody else but mob. And this was the feature of the conversation which impressed Clennam, as a man not used to it, very disagreeably, making him doubt if it were quite right to sit there, silently hearing a great nation narrowed to such little bounds. Remembering, however, that in the parliamentary debates, whether on the life of that nation's body or the life of its soul, the question was usually all about and between John Barnacle, Augustus Stiltstalking, William Barnacle, and Tudor Stiltstalking, Tom, Dick, or Harry Barnacle, or Stiltstalking, and nobody else, he said nothing on the part of mob, bethinking himself that mob was used to it. Mr. Henry Gowan seemed to have a malicious pleasure in playing off the three talkers against each other, and in seeing Clennam startled by what they said. Having as supreme a contempt for the class that had thrown him off as for the class that had not taken him on, he had no personal disquiet in anything that passed. His healthy state of mind appeared to derive a gratification from Clennam's position of embarrassment and isolation among the good company, and if Clennam had been in that condition with which nobody was incessantly contending, he would have suspected it, and would have struggled with a suspicion as a meanness, even while he sat at the table. In the course of a couple of hours, the noble refrigerator, at no time less than 100 years behind the period, got about 5 centuries in arrears, and delivered solemn political oracles appropriate to that epoch. He finished by freezing a cup of tea for his own drinking, and retiring at his lowest temperature. Then Mrs. Gowan, who had been accustomed in her days of a vacant armchair beside her to which to summon state to retain her devoted slaves, one by one, for short audiences as marks of her especial favour, invited Clennam with a turn of her fan to approach the presence. He obeyed and took the tripod recently vacated by Lord Lancaster Stiltstalking. "Mr. Clennam," said Mrs. Gowan, Apart from the happiness I have in becoming known to you, though in this odiously inconvenient place, a mere barrack, there is a subject on which I am dying to speak to you. It is the subject in connection with which my son first had, I believe, the pleasure of cultivating your acquaintance." Clennam inclined his head as a generally suitable reply to what he did not yet quite understand. "First," said Mrs. Gowan. "Now, is she really pretty?" In nobody's difficulties, he would have found it very difficult to answer, very difficult indeed to smile and say, "Who?" "Oh, you know," she returned. "This flame of Henry's, this unfortunate fancy. There, if it is a point of honour that I should originate the name, Miss Miggles, Miss Meagles," said Clennam, "is very beautiful." "Men are so often mistaken on these points," returned Mrs. Gowan, shaking her head, "that I candidly confess to you I feel anything but sure of it even now, though it is something to have Henry corroborated with so much gravity and emphasis. He picked the people up at Rome, I think." The phrase would have given nobody mortal offence. Clennam replied, "Excuse me, I doubt if I understand your expression." "Pick the people up," said Mrs. Gowan, tapping the sticks of her closed fan, a large green one which she used as a hand-screen, on her little table. "Came upon them, found them out, stumbled up against them." "The people?" "Yes, the Miggles people." "I really cannot say," said Clennam, "where my friend Mr. Meagles first presented Mr. Henry Gowan to his daughter. I am pretty sure he picked her up at Rome, but never mind where, somewhere. Now, this is entirely between ourselves. Is she very plebeian?" "Really, ma'am," returned Clennam, "I am so undoubtedly plebeian myself that I do not feel qualified to judge." "Very neat," said Mrs. Gowan, coolly unfurling her screen. "Very happy, from which I infer that you secretly think her manner equal to her looks." Clennam, after a moment's stiffness, bowed. "That's comforting, and I hope you may be right. Did Henry tell me you had travelled with them?" "I travelled with my friend Mr. Meagles and his wife and daughter during some months." Nobody's heart might have been wrung by the remembrance. "Really comforting, because you must have had a large experience of them. You see, Mr. Clennam, this thing has been going on for a long time, and I find no improvement in it. Therefore, to have the opportunity of speaking to one so well informed about it as yourself is an immense relief to me. Quite a boon, quite a blessing, I am sure." "Pardon me," returned Clennam, "but I am not in Mr. Henry Gowan's confidence. I am far from being so well informed as you suppose me to be. Your mistake makes my position a very delicate one. No word on this topic has ever passed between Mr. Henry Gowan and myself." Mrs. Gowan glanced at the other end of the room, where her son was playing a cart on a sofa with the old lady who was for a charge of cavalry. "Not in his confidence? No," said Mrs. Gowan. "No word has passed between you? No. That I can imagine. But there are unexpressed confidences, Mr. Clennam, and as you have been together intimately among these people, I cannot doubt that a confidence of that sort exists in the present case. Perhaps you have heard that I have suffered the keenest distress of mind from Henry's having taken to a pursuit which, well," shrugging her shoulders, "a very respectable pursuit, I dare say, and some artists are, as artists, quite superior persons. Still, we never yet in our family have gone beyond an amateur, and it is a pardonable weakness to feel a little—" As Mrs. Gowan broke off to heave a sigh, Clennam, however resolute to be magnanimous, could not keep down the thought that there was mighty little danger of the family's ever going beyond an amateur, even as it was. "Henry," the mother resumed, "is self-willed and resolute, and as these people naturally strain every nerve to catch him, I can entertain very little hope, Mr. Clennam, that the thing will be broken off. I apprehend the girl's fortune will be very small. Henry might have done much better. There is scarcely anything to compensate for the connection. Still, he acts for himself, and if I find no improvement within a short time, I see no other course than to resign myself and make the best of these people. I am infinitely obliged to you for what you have told me." As she shrugged her shoulders, Clennam stiffly bowed again. With an uneasy flush upon his face and hesitation in his manner, he then said, in a still lower tone than he had adopted yet, "Mrs. Gowan, I scarcely know how to acquit myself of what I feel to be a duty, and yet I must ask you for your kind consideration in attempting to discharge it. A misconception on your part, a very great misconception, if I may venture to call it so, seems to require setting right. You have supposed Mr. Meagles and his family to strain every nerve, I think you said." "Every nerve," repeated Mrs. Gowan, looking at him in calm obstinacy, with her green fan between her face and the fire. "To secure Mr. Henry Gowan?" The lady placidly assented. "Now that is so far," said Arthur, "from being the case, that I know Mr. Meagles to be unhappy in this matter, and to have interposed all reasonable obstacles with the hope of putting an end to it." Mrs. Gowan shut up her great fan, tapped him on the arm with it, and tapped her smiling lips. "Why, of course," said she, "just what I mean." Arthur watched her face for some explanation of what she did mean. "Are you really serious, Mr. Clennam? Don't you see?" Arthur did not see, and said so. "Why, don't I know my son, and don't I know that this is exactly the way to hold him?" said Mrs. Gowan contemptuously. "And do not these Miggles people know it, at least as well as I? Oh, shrewd people, Mr. Clennam, evidently people of business. I believe Miggles belonged to a bank. It ought to have been a very profitable bank, if he had much to do with its management. This is very well done indeed." "I beg and entreat you, ma'am," Arthur interposed. "Oh, Mr. Clennam, can you really be so credulous?" It made such a painful impression upon him to hear her talking in this haughty tone, and to see her patting her contemptuous lips with her fan, that he said very earnestly, "Believe me, ma'am, this is unjust, a perfectly groundless suspicion." "Suspicion," repeated Mrs. Gowan. "Not suspicion, Mr. Clennam. Certainty. It is very knowingly done indeed, and seems to have taken you in completely." She laughed, and again sat tapping her lips with her fan, and tossing her head as if she added, "Don't tell me. I know such people would do anything for the honour of such an alliance." At this opportune moment, the cards were thrown up, and Mr. Henry Gowan came across the room, saying, "Mother, if you can spare Mr. Clennam for this time, we have a long way to go, and it's getting late." Mr. Clennam thereupon rose, as he had no chance but to do, and Mrs. Gowan showed him, to the last, the same look and the same tapped, contemptuous lips. "You have had a portentously long audience of my mother," said Gowan, as the door closed upon them. "I fervently hope she has not bored you." "Not at all," said Clennam. They had a little open phaeton for the journey, and were soon in it on the road home. Gowan, driving, lighted a cigar. Clennam declined one. Do what he would, he fell into such a mood of abstraction that Gowan said again, "I am very much afraid my mother has bored you," to which he roused himself to answer, "Not at all," and soon relapsed again. In that state of mind, which rendered nobody uneasy, his thoughtfulness would have turned principally on the man at his side. He would have thought of the morning when he first saw him rooting out the stones with his heel, and would have asked himself, "Does he jerk me out of the path in the same careless, cruel way?" He would have thought, had this introduction to his mother been brought about by him because he knew what she would say, and that he could thus place his position before a rival and loftily warn him off, without himself reposing a word of confidence in him. He would have thought, even if there were no such design as that, had he brought him there to play with his repressed emotions and torment him, the current of these meditations would have been stayed sometimes by a rush of shame, being a remonstrance to himself from his own open nature, representing that to shelter such suspicions, even for the passing moment, was not to hold the high, unenvious course he had resolved to keep. At those times the striving within him would have been hardest, and looking up and catching Gowan's eyes, he would have started as if he had done him an injury. Then, looking at the dark road and its uncertain objects, he would have gradually trailed off again into thinking, "Where are we driving, he and I wonder, on the darker road of life? How will it be with us, and with her, in the obscure distance?" Thinking of her, he would have been troubled anew with a reproachful misgiving that it was not even loyal to her to dislike him, and that in being so easily prejudiced against him, he was less deserving of her than at first. "You are evidently out of spirits," said Gowan. "I am very much afraid my mother must have bored you dreadfully." "Believe me, not at all," said Clennam. "It's nothing. Nothing." Chapter 27. 25. A frequently recurring doubt whether Mr. Pank's desire to collect information relative to the Dorrit family could have any possible bearing on the misgivings he had imparted to his mother on his return from his long exile caused Arthur Clennam much uneasiness at this period. What Mr. Panks already knew about the Dorrit family, what more he really wanted to find out, and why he should trouble his busy head about them at all, were questions that often perplexed him. Mr. Panks was not a man to waste his time and trouble in researches prompted by idle curiosity. That he had a specific object Clennam could not doubt, and whether the attainment of that object by Mr. Panks' industry might bring to light, in some untimely way, secret reasons which had induced his mother to take little Dorrit by the hand, was a serious speculation. Not that he ever wavered either in his desire or his determination to repair a wrong that had been done in his father's time, should a wrong come to light and be repairable. The shadow of a supposed act of injustice, which had hung over him since his father's death, was so vague and formless that it might be the result of a reality widely remote from the idea of it. But if his apprehensions should prove to be well-founded, he was ready at any moment to lay down all he had and begin the world anew. As the fierce, dark teaching of his childhood had never sunk into his heart, so that first article in his code of morals was that he must begin, in practical humility, with looking well to his feet on earth, and that he could never mount on wings of words to heaven. Duty on earth, restitution on earth, action on earth, these first, as the first steep steps upward. Strait was the gate and narrow was the way, far straighter and narrower than the broad high road paved with vain professions and vain repetitions, motes from other men's eyes and liberal delivery of others to the judgment, all cheap materials costing absolutely nothing. No, it was not a selfish fear or hesitation that rendered him uneasy, but a mistrust lest Panks might not observe his part of the understanding between them, and, making any discovery, might take some course upon it without imparting it to him. On the other hand, when he recalled his conversation with Panks, and the little reason he had to suppose that there was any likelihood of that strange personage being on that track at all, there were times when he wondered that he made so much of it. Labouring in this sea, as all barks labour in cross seas, he tossed about and came to no haven. The removal of little Dorrit herself from their customary association did not mend the matter. She was so much out and so much in her own room that he began to miss her and to find a blank space in her place. He had written to her to inquire if she were better, and she had written back, very gratefully and earnestly, telling him not to be uneasy on her behalf, for she was quite well, but he had not seen her for what, in their intercourse, was a long time. He returned home one evening from an interview with her father, who had mentioned that she was out visiting, which was what he always said when she was hard at work to buy his supper, and found Mr. Meagles in an excited state, walking up and down his room. On his opening the door, Mr. Meagles stopped, faced round, and said, "Clennam, Tattycoram." "What's the matter?" "Lost." "Why, bless my heart alive!" cried Clennam in amazement. "What do you mean?" "Wouldn't count 25, sir. Couldn't be got to do it. Stopped at 8 and took herself off." "Left your house?" "Never to come back," said Mr. Meagles, shaking his head. "You don't know that girl's passionate and proud character. A team of horses couldn't draw her back now. The bolts and bars of the old Bastille couldn't keep her." "How did it happen? Pray sit down and tell me." "As to how it happened, it's not easy to relate, because you must have the unfortunate temperament of the poor impetuous girl herself before you can fully understand it. But it came about in this way. Pet and her mother and I have been having a good deal of talk together of late. I'll not disguise from you, Clennam, that those conversations have not been of as bright a kind as I could wish. They have referred to our going away again, in proposing to do which I have had, in fact, an object." Nobody's heart beat quickly. "An object," said Mr. Meagles, after a moment's pause, "that I will not disguise from you either, Clennam. There's an inclination on the part of my dear child which I am sorry for. Perhaps you guess the person. Henry Gowan." I was not unprepared to hear it. "Well," said Mr. Meagles with a heavy sigh, "I wish to God you had never had to hear it. However, so it is. Mother and I have done all we could to get the better of it, Clennam. We have tried tender advice, we have tried time, we have tried absence. As yet, of no use. Our late conversations have been upon the subject of going away for another year at least, in order that there might be an entire separation and breaking off for that term. Upon that question, Pet has been unhappy, and therefore Mother and I have been unhappy." Clennam said that he could easily believe it. "Well," continued Mr. Meagles in an apologetic way, "I admit as a practical man, and I am sure Mother would admit as a practical woman, that we do in families magnify our troubles and make mountains of our molehills in a way that is calculated to be rather trying to people who look on, to mere outsiders, you know, Clennam. Still, Pet's happiness or unhappiness is quite a life or death question with us, and we may be excused, I hope, for making much of it. At all events, it might have been borne by Tattycoram. Now, don't you think so?" "I do indeed think so," returned Clennam, in most emphatic recognition of this very moderate expectation. "No, sir," said Mr. Meagles, shaking his head ruefully. "She couldn't stand it. The chafing and firing of that girl, the wearing and tearing of that girl within her own breast, has been such that I have softly said to her again and again in passing her, 25, Tattycoram, 25. I heartily wish she could have gone on counting 25 day and night, and then it wouldn't have happened." Mr. Meagles, with a despondent countenance in which the goodness of his heart was even more expressed than in his times of cheerfulness and gaiety, stroked his face down from his forehead to his chin, and shook his head again. "I said to Mother, not that it was necessary, for she would have thought it all for herself. We are practical people, my dear, and we know her story. We see in this unhappy girl some reflection of what was raging in her mother's heart before ever such a creature as this poor thing was in the world. We'll gloss her temper over, Mother. We won't notice it at present, my dear. We'll take advantage of some better disposition in her another time." So we said nothing. But do what we would, it seems as if it was to be. She broke out violently one night. "How and why?" "If you ask me why," said Mr. Meagles, a little disturbed by the question, for he was far more intent on softening her case than the family's, "I can only refer you to what I have just repeated as having been pretty near my words to Mother. As to how, we had said good night to Pet in her presence, very affectionately, I must allow, and she had attended Pet upstairs. You remember she was her maid. Perhaps Pet, having been out of sorts, may have been a little more inconsiderate than usual in requiring services of her, but I don't know that I have any right to say so. She was always thoughtful and gentle." "The gentlest mistress in the world." "Thank you, Clennam," said Mr. Meagles, shaking him by the hand. "You have often seen them together. Well, we presently heard this unfortunate Tattycoram loud and angry, and before we could ask what was the matter, Pet came back in a tremble, saying that she was frightened of her. Close after her came Tattycoram in a flaming rage. "I hate you all three," says she, stamping her foot at us. "I am bursting with hate of the whole house." Upon which you— "I," said Mr. Meagles, with a plain good faith that might have commanded the belief of Mrs. Gowan herself, "I said, 'Count 25, Tattycoram.'" Mr. Meagles again stroked his face and shook his head, and with an air of profound regret. "She was so used to do it, Clennam, that even then, such a picture of passion as you never saw, she stopped short, looked me full in the face, and counted, as I made out, to 8. But she couldn't control herself to go any further. There she broke down, poor thing, and gave the other 17 to the four winds. Then it all burst out. She detested us. She was miserable with us. She couldn't bear it. She wouldn't bear it. She was determined to go away. She was younger than her young mistress, and would she remain to see her always held up as the only creature who was young and interesting and to be cherished and loved? No, she wouldn't, she wouldn't, she wouldn't. What did we think she, Tattycoram, might have been if she had been caressed and cared for in her childhood like her young mistress? As good as her? Ah, perhaps 50 times as good. When we pretended to be so fond of one another, we exulted over her. That was what we did. We exulted over her and shamed her. And all in the house did the same. They talked about their fathers and mothers and brothers and sisters. They liked to drag them up before her face. There was Mrs. Tickett only yesterday, when her little grandchild was with her, had been amused by the child's trying to call her Tattycoram by the wretched name we gave her, and had laughed at the name. Why, who didn't? And who were we that we should have a right to name her like a dog or a cat? But she didn't care. She would take no more benefits from us. She would fling us her name back again, and she would go. She would leave us that minute. Nobody should stop her, and we should never hear of her again. Mr. Meagles had recited all this with such a vivid remembrance of his original that he was almost as flushed and hot by this time as he described her to have been. "Ah, well," he said, wiping his face, "it was of no use trying reason then, with that vehement, panting creature. Heaven knows what her mother's story must have been. So I quietly told her that she should not go at that late hour of night, and I gave her my hand and took her to her room, and locked the house doors. But she was gone this morning." "And you know no more of her?" "No more," returned Mr. Meagles. "I have been hunting all about the day. She must have gone very early and very silently. I have found no trace of her down about us." "Stay. You want," said Clennam after a moment's reflection, "to see her? I assume that?" "Yes, assuredly. I want to give her another chance. Mother and Pet want to give her another chance. Come, you yourself," said Mr. Meagles persuasively, as if the provocation to be angry were not his own at all, "want to give the poor passionate girl another chance? I know Clennam." "It would be strange and hard indeed if I did not," said Clennam, "when you are also forgiving. What I was going to ask you was, have you thought of that Miss Wade?" "I have. I did not think of her until I had pervaded the whole of our neighbourhood, and I don't know that I should have done so then but for finding Mother and Pet, when I went home, full of the idea that Tattycoram must have gone to her. Then, of course, I recalled what she said that day at dinner when you were first with us." "Have you any idea where Miss Wade is to be found?" "To tell you the truth," returned Mr. Meagles, "it's because I have an addle jumble of a notion on that subject that you found me waiting here. There is one of those odd impressions in my house which do mysteriously get into houses sometimes, which nobody seems to have picked up in a distinct form from anybody, and yet which everybody seems to have got hold of loosely from somebody and let go again, that she lives or was living thereabouts." Mr. Meagles handed him a slip of paper on which was written the name of one of the dull by-streets in the Grosvenor region, near Park Lane. "Here is no number," said Arthur, looking over it. "No number, my dear Clennam," returned his friend. "No anything. The very name of the street may have been floating in the air, for, as I tell you, none of my people can say where they got it from. However, it's worth an inquiry, and as I would rather make it in company than alone, and as you too were a fellow-traveller of that immovable woman's, I thought perhaps—" Clennam finished the sentence for him by taking up his hat again and saying he was ready. It was now summer-time, a grey, hot, dusty evening. They rode to the top of Oxford Street, and there, alighting, dived in among the great streets of melancholy stateliness, and the little streets that try to be as stately and succeed in being more melancholy, of which there is a labyrinth near Park Lane. Wildernesses of corner houses, with barbarous old porticos and appurtenances, horrors that came into existence under some wrong-headed person in some wrong-headed time, still demanding the blind admiration of all ensuing generations, and determined to do so until they tumbled down, frowned upon the twilight. Parasite little tenements, with the cramp in their whole frame, from the dwarf hall door on the giant model of his Grace's in the square to the squeezed window of the boudoir commanding the dunghills in the mews, made the evening doleful. Rickety dwellings of undoubted fashion, but of a capacity to hold nothing comfortably except a dismal smell, looked like the last result of the great mansions, breeding in, and where their little supplementary bows and balconies were supported on thin iron columns, seemed to be scrofulously resting upon crutches. Here and there a hatchment, with the whole science of heraldry in it, loomed down upon the street, like an archbishop discoursing on vanity. The shops, few in number, made no show, for popular opinion was as nothing to them. The pastry-cook knew who was on his books, and in that knowledge could be calm, with a few glass cylinders of dowager peppermint drops in his window, and half a dozen ancient specimens of currant jelly. A few oranges formed the greengrocer's whole concession to the vulgar mind. A single basket made of moss, once containing plover's eggs, held all that the poulterer had to say to the rabble. Everybody in those streets seemed, which is always the case at that hour and season, to be gone out to dinner, and nobody seemed to be giving the dinners they had gone to. On the doorsteps there were lounging footmen, with bright party-coloured plumage and white poles, like an extinct race of monstrous birds, and butlers, solitary men of recluse demeanour, each of whom appeared distrustful of all other butlers. The roll of carriages in the park was done for the day. The street lamps were lighting, and wicked little grooms in the tightest-fitting garments, with twists in their legs answering to the twists in their minds, hung about in pairs, chewing straws and exchanging fraudulent secrets. The spotted dogs who went out with the carriages, and who were so associated with splendid equipages that it looked like a condescension in those animals to come out without them, accompanied helpers to and fro on messages. Here and there was a retiring public house, which did not require to be supported on the shoulders of the people, and where gentlemen out of livery were not much wanted. This last discovery was made by the two friends in pursuing their inquiries. Nothing was there or anywhere known of such a person as Miss Wade in connection with the street they sought. It was one of the parasite streets, long, regular, narrow, dull, and gloomy, like a brick-and-mortar funeral. They inquired at several little area gates, where a dejected youth stood spiking his chin on the summit of a precipitous little chute of wooden steps, but could gain no information. They walked up the street on one side of the way, and down it on the other, what time, too, vociferous news-sellers, announcing an extraordinary event that had never happened and never would happen, pitched their hoarse voices into the secret chambers. But nothing came of it. At length they stood at the corner from which they had begun, and it had fallen quite dark, and they were no wiser. It happened that in the street they had several times passed a dingy house, apparently empty, with bills in the windows, announcing that it was to let. The bills, as a variety in the funeral procession, almost accounted to a decoration, perhaps because they kept the house separated in his mind, or perhaps because Mr. Meagles and himself had twice agreed in passing, "It is clear she don't live there." Clennam now proposed that they should go back and try that house before finally going away. Mr. Meagles agreed, and back they went. They knocked once, and they rang twice, without any response. "Empty," said Mr. Meagles, listening. "Once more," said Clennam, and knocked again. "After that knock?" they heard a movement below and somebody shuffling up towards the door. The confined entrance was so dark that it was impossible to make out distinctly what kind of person opened the door, but it appeared to be an old woman. "Excuse our troubling you," said Clennam. "Pray, can you tell us where Miss Wade lives?" The voice in the darkness unexpectedly replied, "Lives here." "Is she at home?" No answer coming, Mr. Meagles asked again, "Pray, is she at home?" After another delay, "I suppose she is," said the voice abruptly. "You had better come in, and I'll ask." They were summarily shut into the close black house, and the figure rustling away and speaking from a higher level said, "Come up, if you please. You can't tumble over anything." They groped their way upstairs towards a faint light, which proved to be the light of the street shining through a window, and the figure left them shut in an airless room. "This is odd, Clennam," said Mr. Meagles softly. "Odd enough," assented Clennam in the same tone, "but we have succeeded, that's the main point. Here's a light coming." The light was a lamp, and the bearer was an old woman, very dirty, very wrinkled and dry. "She's at home," she said, and the voice was the same that had spoken before. "She'll come directly." Having set the lamp down on the table, the old woman dusted her hands on her apron, which she might have done forever without cleaning them, looked at the visitors with a dim pair of eyes, and backed out. The lady whom they had come to see, if she were the present occupant of the house, appeared to have taken up her quarters there, as she might have established herself in an Eastern caravanserai. A small square of carpet in the middle of the room, a few articles of furniture that evidently did not belong to the room, and a disorder of trunks and travelling articles formed the whole of her surroundings. Under some former regular inhabitant, the stifling little apartment had broken out into a pier glass and a gilt table, but the gilding was as faded as last year's flowers, and the glass was so clouded that it seemed to hold in magic preservation all the fogs and bad weather it had ever reflected. The visitors had had a minute or two to look about them, when the door opened and Miss Wade came in. She was exactly the same as when they had parted, just as handsome, just as scornful, just as repressed. She manifested no surprise in seeing them, nor any other emotion. She requested them to be seated, and declining to take a seat herself, at once anticipated any introduction of their business. "I apprehend," she said, "that I know the cause of your favouring me with this visit. We may come to it at once." "The cause, then, ma'am," said Mr. Meagles, "is Tattycoram." "So I supposed." "Miss Wade," said Mr. Meagles, "will you be so kind as to say whether you know anything of her?" "Surely. I know she is here with me." "Then, ma'am," said Mr. Meagles, "allow me to make known to you that I shall be happy to have her back, and that my wife and daughter will be happy to have her back. She has been with us a long time. We don't forget her claims upon us, and I hope we know how to make allowances." "You hope to know how to make allowances," she returned in a level, measured voice. "For what?" "I think my friend would say, Miss Wade," Arthur Clennam interposed, seeing Mr. Meagles rather at a loss, "for the passionate sense that sometimes comes upon the poor girl of being at a disadvantage, which occasionally gets the better of better remembrances." The lady broke into a smile as she turned her eyes upon him. "Indeed," was all she answered. She stood by the table so perfectly composed, and still after this acknowledgment of his remark, that Mr. Meagles stared at her under a sort of fascination, and could not even look to Clennam to make another move. After waiting, awkwardly enough, for some moments, Arthur said, "Perhaps it would be well if Mr. Meagles could see her, Miss Wade." "That is easily done," said she. "Come here, child." She had opened a door while saying this, and now led the girl in by the hand. It was very curious to see them standing together, the girl with her disengaged fingers plaiting the bosom of her dress, half irresolutely, half passionately. Miss Wade with her composed face attentively regarding her, and suggesting to an observer with extraordinary force in her composure itself, as a veil will suggest the form it covers, the unquenchable passion of her own nature. "See here," she said in the same level way as before. "Here is your patron, your master. He is willing to take you back, my dear, if you are sensible of the favour and choose to go. You can be again a foil to his pretty daughter, a slave to her pleasant wilfulness, and a toy in the house, showing the goodness of the family. You can have your droll name again, playfully pointing you out and setting you apart, as it is right that you should be pointed out and set apart. Your birth, you know, you must not forget your birth. You can again be shown to this gentleman's daughter, Harriet, and kept before her as a living reminder of her own superiority and her gracious condescension. You can recover all these advantages and many more of the same kind, which I dare say start up in your memory while I speak, and which you lose in taking refuge with me. You can recover them all by telling these gentlemen how humbled and penitent you are, and by going back to them to be forgiven. What do you say, Harriet? Will you go?" The girl, who, under the influence of these words, had gradually risen in anger and heightened in colour, answered, raising her lustrous black eyes for the moment, and clenching her hand upon the folds it had been puckering up, "I'd die sooner." Miss Wade, still standing at her side, holding her hand, looked quietly round and said with a smile, "Gentlemen, what do you do upon that?" Poor Mr. Meagles' inexpressible consternation in hearing his motives and actions so perverted had prevented him from interposing any word until now, but now he regained the power of speech. "Tattycoram," said he, "for I'll call you by that name still, my good girl, conscious that I meant nothing but kindness when I gave it to you, and conscious that you know it—" "I don't," said she, looking up again, and almost rending herself with the same busy hand. "No, not now, perhaps," said Mr. Meagles, "not with that lady's eyes so intent upon you, Tattycoram." She glanced at them for a moment. "And that power over you, which we see she exercises, not now, perhaps, but at another time. Tattycoram, I'll not ask that lady whether she believes what she has said, even in the anger and ill blood in which I and my friend here equally know she has spoken, though she subdues herself with a determination that any one who has once seen her is not likely to forget. I'll not ask you, with your remembrance of my house and all belonging to it, whether you believe it. I'll only say that you have no profession to make to me or mine, and no forgiveness to entreat, and that all in the world that I ask you to do is to count 25, Tattycoram." She looked at him for an instant, and then said frowningly, "I won't, Miss Wade. Take me away, please." The contention that raged within her had no softening in it now. It was wholly between passionate defiance and stubborn defiance. Her rich colour, her quick blood, her rapid breath were all setting themselves against the opportunity of retracing their steps. "I won't, I won't, I won't," she repeated in a low, thick voice. "I'd be torn to pieces first. I'd tear myself to pieces first." Miss Wade, who had released her hold, laid her hand protectingly on the girl's neck for a moment, and then said, looking round with her former smile and speaking exactly in her former tone, "Gentlemen, what do you do upon that?" "Oh, Tattycoram, Tattycoram," cried Mr. Meagles, adjuring her besides with an earnest hand. "Hear that lady's voice, look at that lady's face, consider what is in that lady's heart, and think what a future lies before you. My child, whatever you may think, that lady's influence over you, astonishing to us, and I should hardly go too far in saying terrible to us to see, is founded in passion fiercer than yours, and temper more violent than yours. What can you two be together? What can come of it?" "I am alone here, gentlemen," observed Miss Wade with no change of voice or manner. "Say anything you will." "Politeness must yield to this misguided girl, ma'am," said Mr. Meagles, "at her present pass, though I hope not altogether to dismiss it, even with the injury you do her so strongly before me. Excuse me for reminding you in her hearing, I must say it, that you were a mystery to all of us, and had nothing in common with any of us when she unfortunately fell in your way. I don't know what you are, but you can't hide, what a dark spirit you have within you. If it should happen that you are a woman who, from whatever cause, has a perverted delight in making a sister woman as wretched as she is, I am old enough to have heard of such. I warn her against you, and I warn you against yourself. Gentlemen, said Miss Wade calmly, when you have concluded, Mr. Clennam, perhaps you will induce your friend. Not without another effort, said Mr. Meagles stoutly. My poor dear girl, count 25. Do not reject the hope, the certainty this kind man offers you, said Clennam, in a low, emphatic voice. Turn to the friends you have not forgotten. Think once more. I won't, Miss Wade, said the girl, with her bosom swelling high and speaking with her hand held to her throat. Take me away. Tattycoram, said Mr. Meagles. Once more yet. The only thing I ask of you in the world, my child, count 25. She put her hands tightly over her ears, confusedly tumbling down her bright black hair in the vehemence of the action, and turned her face resolutely to the wall. Miss Wade, who had watched her under this final appeal with that strange attentive smile and that repressing hand upon her own bosom with which she had watched her in her struggle at Marseilles, then put her arm about her waist as if she took possession of her for evermore. And there was a visible triumph in her face when she turned it to dismiss the visitors. As it is the last time I shall have the honour, she said, and as you have spoken of not knowing what I am, and also of the foundation of my influence here, you may now know that it is founded in a common cause. What your broken plaything is as to birth, I am. She has no name, I have no name. Her wrong is my wrong. I have nothing more to say to you. This was addressed to Mr. Meagles, who sorrowfully went out. As Clennam followed, she said to him, with the same external composure, and in the same level voice, but with a smile that is only seen on cruel faces, a very faint smile, lifting the nostril, scarcely touching the lips, and not breaking away gradually, but instantly dismissed when done with. I hope the wife of your dear friend Mr. Gowan may be happy in the contrast of her extraction to this girl's and mine, and in the high good fortune that awaits her. Chapter 28. Nobody's Disappearance. Not resting satisfied with the endeavours he had made to recover his lost charge, Mr. Meagles addressed a letter of remonstrance, breathing nothing but goodwill, not only to her, but to Miss Wade, too. No answer coming to these epistles, or to another written to the stubborn girl by the hand of her late young mistress, which might have melted her if anything could, all 3 letters were returned weeks afterwards as having been refused at the house door. He deputed Mrs. Meagles to make the experiment of a personal interview. That worthy lady being unable to obtain one, and being steadfastly denied admission, Mr. Meagles besought Arthur to essay once more what he could do. All that came of this compliance was his discovery that the empty house was left in charge of the old woman, that Miss Wade was gone, that the waifs and strays of furniture were gone, and that the old woman would accept any number of half-crowns and thank the donor kindly, but no information whatever to exchange for those coins, beyond constantly offering for perusal a memorandum relative to fixtures which the house agent's young man had left in the hall. Unwilling, even under the discomfiture, to resign the ingrate and leave her hopeless, in case of her better dispositions obtaining the mastery over the darker side of her character, Mr. Meagles, for 6 successive days, published a discreetly covert advertisement in the morning papers, to the effect that if a certain young person, who had lately left home without reflection, would at any time apply to his address at Twickenham, everything would be as it had been before, and no reproaches need be apprehended. The unexpected consequences of this notification suggested to the dismayed Mr. Meagles for the first time that some hundreds of young persons must be leaving their homes without reflection every day. For shoals of wrong young people came down to Twickenham, who, not finding themselves received with enthusiasm, generally demanded compensation by way of damages, in addition to coach hire there and back. Nor were these the only uninvited clients whom the advertisement produced. The swarm of begging letter writers, who would seem to be always watching eagerly for any hook, however small, to hang a letter upon, wrote to say that, having seen the advertisement, they were induced to apply with confidence for various sums, ranging from 10 shillings to £50, not because they knew anything about the young person, but because they felt that to part with those donations would greatly relieve the advertiser's mind. Several projectors, likewise, availed themselves of the same opportunity to correspond with Mr. Meagles, as, for example, to apprise him that, their attention having been called to the advertisement by a friend, they begged to state that if they should ever hear anything of the young person, they would not fail to make it known to him immediately, and that, in the meantime, if he would oblige them with the funds necessary for bringing to perfection a certain entirely novel description of Pump, the happiest results would ensue to mankind. Mr. Meagles and his family, under these combined discouragements, had begun reluctantly to give up Tattycoram as irrecoverable, when the new and active firm of Doyce and Clennam, in their private capacities, went down on a Saturday to stay at the cottage until Monday. The senior partner took the coach, and the junior partner took his walking-stick. A tranquil summer sunset shone upon him as he approached the end of his walk and passed through the meadows by the riverside. He had that sense of peace and of being lightened of a weight of care which country quiet awakens in the breasts of dwellers in towns. Everything within his view was lovely and placid. The rich foliage of the trees, the luxuriant grass diversified with wild flowers, the little green islands in the river, the beds of rushes, the water lilies floating on the surface of the stream, the distant voices in boats borne musically towards him on the ripple of the water, and the evening air, were all expressive of rest. In the occasional leap of a fish, or dip of an oar, or twittering of a bird not yet at roost, or distant barking of a dog, or lowing of a cow, in all such sounds there was the prevailing breath of rest, which seemed to encompass him in every scent that sweetened the fragrant air. The long lines of red and gold in the sky, and the glorious track of the descending sun, were all divinely calm. Upon the purple tree-tops far away, and on the green height near at hand, up which the shades were slowly creeping, there was an equal hush. Between the real landscape and its shadow in the water, there was no division. Both were so untroubled and clear, and, while so fraught with solemn mystery of life and death, so hopefully reassuring to the gazer's soothed heart, because so tenderly and mercifully beautiful. Clennam had stopped, not for the first time by many times, to look about him and suffer what he saw to sink into his soul, as the shadows looked at seemed to sink deeper and deeper into the water. He was slowly resuming his way when he saw a figure in the path before him, which he had perhaps already associated with the evening and its impressions. Minnie was there, alone. She had some roses in her hand, and seemed to have stood still on seeing him, waiting for him. Her face was towards him, and she appeared to have been coming from the opposite direction. There was a flutter in her manner, which Clennam had never seen in it before, and as he came near her, it entered his mind all at once that she was there of a set purpose to speak to him. She gave him her hand and said, "You wonder to see me here by myself, but the evening's so lovely. I have strolled further than I meant at first. I thought it likely I might meet you, and that made me more confident. You always come this way, do you not?" As Clennam said that it was his favourite way, he felt her hand falter on his arm and saw the roses shake. "Will you let me give you one, Mr. Clennam? I gathered them as I came out of the garden. Indeed, I almost gathered them for you, thinking it so likely I might meet you. Mr. Doyce arrived more than an hour ago and told us you were walking down." His own hand shook as he accepted a rose or two from hers and thanked her. They were now by an avenue of trees. Whether they turned into it on his movement or on hers matters little. He never knew how that was. "It is very grave here," said Clennam, "but very pleasant at this hour. Passing along this deep shade and out of that arch of light at the other end we come upon the ferry and the cottage by the best approach, I think." In her simple garden hat and her light summer dress, with her rich brown hair naturally clustering about her, and her wonderful eyes raised to his for a moment with a look in which regard for him and trustfulness in him were strikingly blended with a kind of timid sorrow for him, she was so beautiful that it was well for his peace, or ill for his peace, he did not quite know which, that he had made that vigorous resolution he had so often thought about. She broke a momentary silence by inquiring if he knew that Papa had been thinking of another tour abroad. He said that he had heard it mentioned. She broke another momentary silence by adding with some hesitation that Papa had abandoned the idea. At this he thought directly. They are to be married. "Mr. Clennam," she said, hesitating more timidly yet, and speaking so low that he bent his head to hear her, "I should very much like to give you my confidence, if you would not mind having the goodness to receive it. I should have very much liked to have given it to you long ago, because I felt that you were becoming so much our friend." "How can I be otherwise than proud of it at any time? Pray give it to me. Pray trust me." "I could never have been afraid of trusting you," she returned, raising her eyes frankly to his face. "I think I would have done so some time ago if I had known how, but I scarcely know how even now." "Mr. Gowan," said Arthur Clennam, "has reason to be very happy. God bless his wife and him." She wept as she tried to thank him. He reassured her, took her hand as it lay with the trembling roses in it on his arm, took the remaining roses from it, and put it to his lips. At that time, it seemed to him, he first finally resigned the dying hope that had flickered in nobody's heart so much to its pain and trouble, and from that time he became, in his own eyes, as to any similar hope or prospect, a very much older man who had done with that part of life. He put the roses in his breast, and they walked on for a little while, slowly and silently, under the umbrageous trees. Then he asked her in a voice of cheerful kindness, was there anything else that she would say to him as her friend and her father's friend, many years older than herself? Was there any trust she would repose in him, any service she would ask of him, any little aid to her happiness that she would give him the lasting gratification of believing it was in his power to render? She was going to answer, when she was so touched by some little hidden sorrow or sympathy, what could it have been, that she said, bursting into tears again, "Oh, Mr. Clennam, good, generous Mr. Clennam, pray tell me you do not blame me." "I blame you?" said Clennam. "My dearest girl, I blame you? No." After clasping both her hands upon his arm, and looking confidently up into his face, with some hurried words to the effect that she thanked him from her heart, as she did, if it be the source of earnestness, she gradually composed herself, with now and then a word of encouragement from him, as they walked on slowly, almost silently, under the darkening trees. "And now, Minnie Gowan," at length said Clennam, smiling, "will you ask me nothing?" "Oh, I have very much to ask you." "That's well. I hope so. I am not disappointed. You know how I am loved at home, and how I love home. You can hardly think it, perhaps, dear Mr. Clennam," she spoke with great agitation, "seeing me going from it of my own free will and choice, but I do so dearly love it." "I am sure of that," said Clennam. "Can you suppose I doubt it?" "No, no. But it is strange even to me that loving it so much and being so much beloved in it, I can bear to cast it away. It seems so neglectful of it, so unthankful." "My dear girl," said Clennam, "it is in the natural progress and change of time. All homes are left so." "Yes, I know, but all homes are not left with such a blank in them as there will be in mine when I am gone. Not that there is any scarcity of far better and more endearing and more accomplished girls than I am, not that I am much, but that they have made so much of me." Pet's affectionate heart was overcharged, and she sobbed while she pictured what would happen. I know what a change Papa will feel at first, and I know that at first I cannot be to him anything like what I have been these many years. And it is then, Mr. Clennam, then more than at any time, that I beg and entreat you to remember him, and sometimes to keep him company when you can spare a little while, and to tell him that you know I was fonder of him when I left him than I ever was in all my life. For there is nobody, he told me so himself when he talked of me this very day, there is nobody he likes so well as you, or trusts so much. A clue to what had passed between the father and daughter dropped like a heavy stone into the well of Clennam's heart, and swelled the water to his eyes. He said, cheerily, but not quite so cheerily as he tried to say, that it should be done, that he gave her his faithful promise. "If I do not speak of mamma," said Pet, more moved by, and more pretty in her innocent grief than Clennam could trust himself even to consider, for which reason he counted the trees between them and the fading light as they slowly diminished in number, "it is because mamma will understand me better in this action, and will feel my loss in a different way, and will look forward in a different manner. But you know what a dear, devoted mother she is, and you will remember her too, will you not?" Let Minnie trust him, Clennam said. Let Minnie trust him to do all she wished. "And dear Mr. Clennam," said Minnie, "because Papa and one whom I need not name do not fully appreciate and understand one another yet, as they will by and by, and because it will be the duty and the pride and pleasure of my new life to draw them to a better knowledge of one another, and to be a happiness to one another, and to be proud of one another, and to love one another, both loving me so dearly, oh, as you are so kind, true man, when I am first separated from home, I am going a long distance away. Try to reconcile Papa to him a little more, and use your great influence to keep him before Papa's mind free from prejudice and in his real form. Will you do this for me, as you are a noble-hearted friend?" Poor Pet, self-deceived, mistaken child. When were such changes ever made in men's natural relations to one another? When was such reconcilement of ingrained differences ever effected? It has been tried many times by other daughters, Minnie. It has never succeeded. Nothing has ever come of it but failure. So Clennam thought. So he did not say. It was too late. He bound himself to do all she asked, and she knew full well that he would do it. They were now at the last tree in the avenue. She stopped and withdrew her arm, speaking to him with her eyes lifted up to his, and with the hand that had lately rested on his sleeve trembling by touching one of the roses in his breast as an additional appeal to him. She said, "Dear Mr. Clennam, in my happiness, for I am happy, though you have seen me crying, I cannot bear to leave any cloud between us. If you have anything to forgive me, not anything I have wilfully done, but any trouble I may have caused you without meaning it, or having it in my power to help it, forgive me tonight out of your noble heart." He stooped to meet the guileless face that met his without shrinking. He kissed it and answered. Heaven knew that he had nothing to forgive. As he stooped to meet the innocent face once again, she whispered, "Goodbye," and he repeated it. It was taking leave of all his hopes, all nobody's old restless doubts. They came out of the avenue next moment, arm in arm as they had entered it, and the trees seemed to close up behind them in the darkness like their own perspective of the past. The voices of Mr. and Mrs. Meagles and Doyce were audible directly, speaking near the garden gate. Hearing Pet's name among them, Clennam called out, "She is here with me." There was some little wondering and laughing until they came up, but as soon as they had all come together, it ceased, and Pet glided away. Mr. Meagles, Doyce, and Clennam, without speaking, walked up and down on the brink of the river, in the light of the rising moon for a few minutes, and then Doyce lingered behind and went into the house. Mr. Meagles and Clennam walked up and down together for a few minutes more without speaking, until at length the former broke silence. "Arthur," said he, using the familiar address for the first time in their communication, "do you remember my telling you as we walked up and down one hot morning looking over the harbour at Marseilles, that Pet's baby sister who was dead seemed to mother and me to have grown as she had grown and changed as he had changed?" "Very well." You remember my saying that our thoughts had never been able to separate those twin sisters, and that, in our fancy, whatever pet was, the other was. Yes, very well. Arthur, said Mr. Meagles, much subdued, I carry that fancy further tonight. I feel tonight, my dear fellow, as if you had loved my dead child very tenderly, and had lost her when she was like what pet is now. Thank you, murmured Clennam, thank you, and pressed his hand. Will you come in? Said Mr. Meagles presently. In a little while. Mr. Meagles fell away, and he was left alone. When he had walked on the river's brink, in the peaceful moonlight for some half an hour, he put his hand in his breast and tenderly took out the handful of roses. Perhaps he put them to his heart, perhaps he put them to his lips, but certainly he bent down on the shore and gently launched them on the flowing river. Pale and unreal in the moonlight, the river floated them away. The lights were bright within doors when he entered, and the faces on which they shone, his own face not expected, were soon quietly cheerful. They talked of many subjects. His partner never had such a ready store to draw upon for the beguiling of the time, and so to bed and to sleep. While the flowers, pale and unreal in the moonlight, floated away upon the river, and thus do greater things that once were in our breasts and near our hearts, flow from us to the eternal seas.